Hello and welcome to Beyond the Mekong. My name is Luke Hunt. This is another podcast for The Diplomat, and with me today is Nick Dunlop. Nick is a very well-known photographer, filmmaker and author. He's a beautiful writer, and today we're going to talk about the World Press Photo and the awards which are steeped in history, very well known around the planet, but they've come in for some deserved criticism over what constitutes a great press photo. And it brings into all sorts of questions like the definition of aesthetics and exactly what is the press these days, given the changes over the last 20 years. Nick, welcome to the program.
Hi, Luke.
I read your article for Lightbox, published a couple of weeks ago, on the World Press Photo, and it wasn't exactly complimentary. At the same time, you weren't going out of your way to be nasty or super critical of the annual awards. But just briefly, what is your impression of the kind of photographs that are being submitted for awards and the type of judging we're seeing, and what do they want?
It's difficult to say, but I was struck by not just this year, but also the preceding few years, the quality of the photography has been one thing I'd say. I mean, there is a problem, right, with trying to define what exactly is what people mean by the press in today's world. I mean, we've got an ever-shifting media landscape. So it's very difficult from that point of view to try and, limit it. But what I've noticed is that there was a real lack of aesthetic, strong aesthetic within the photographs that have been submitted, but also on the World Press social media presence. Mm-hmm. And it called into question. These are not thoughts that I just had myself. I've talked to many of my peers about it, and we were all struck by the same thing. It's just, what were the judging criteria? Because a lot of the images were frankly very weak. And that's what led me to critique it and have a look at the submissions in greater detail and try and understand what was going on.
I think you went quite deep in terms of your analysis. I'll say it for you. I thought some of the photographs which you used as example were actually quite dreadful. They're the types of photographs that would be taken with an iPhone by anyone in the streets, and for some reason someone thought they were worthy of a lot more praise, awards. But starting at the very bottom, how are these photographs even getting into the competition?
That was the question I was wondering. I've taught photography in universities and at high schools, and some of the submissions weren't even worthy of a high school submission. So I don't know. But what I suspect is there is something at play here, which I think is that a belief that somehow the visual language, if you like, of photography is subordinate to something else, to some sort of a message that people want to convey. And I've seen this crop up quite often, which is if you project an image of the world, then maybe that in turn will change the world itself. But the problem with this is that when you have really artless photographs, it doesn't stimulate the part of the brain that activates curiosity. And this is the thing that's always fascinated me about photojournalism and documentary photography, is the fact that you can have very beautiful images that are portraying something that may be very difficult to look at. And it's that tension between, say, for instance, an image of suffering and a beautifully composed image of suffering that's always been, to me, very, of great interest and really fascinating. And that's what I think has been lacking. And the problem is that these artless photographs, where beauty is seen as somehow subordinate, rather than of equal importance to the photographs, it doesn't draw people in. So if you're actually trying to highlight an issue by just simply having photographs that really have got very little in the way of artistic merit, you turn people off, and you're not drawing people into a subject that you want to highlight. So it's actually counterproductive.
Right. One cultural issue that everybody keeps talking about, and I personally try to stay away from it, is the era of being woke. And by that, I'm not trying to steer down, a politically correct path, but it's if you believe what popular conjecture would say, is that we're not allowed to criticise. Everybody is equal. Every photograph would have merit. Everything is telling a story. Looking at that kind of criteria, say for a photo award, it's almost like, well, what's the point of having an award?
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole kind of culture of awards is somewhat odd. I mean, the idea that you can be given an award for a photograph of an execution sort of grates with me, and I'm sure it grates with lots of photographers. I think I've always thought that it's really important to have photographs that where I spent 30 years trying to perfect images to make them aesthetically strong. and convey a message. And I think it's important to highlight, actually, the winner for this year's award was a very strong image from Palestine of an aunt carrying the body of her niece.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, there were some very strong photographs, but they had a very strong aesthetic as well as being powerful in their own right of the subjects that they were depicting. But there were an awful lot of photographs that I felt that simply did not make the grade. And I think what it reflects is firstly, people don't understand in today's media landscape what the press constitutes. I think what a lot of the submissions in this award for the past couple of years reflect is how the lack of aesthetics really, like I say, it's counterproductive. So it's not actually drawing people into the subjects that they want to highlight, but it seems to be, to my mind, there seems to be more of an agenda behind all of this, which is to somehow promote a world that we would rather like to live in rather than the world we in fact do. And I think that's a problem, because what it suggests is that we're actually retreating from reality. I mean, the world is a difficult, violent place, and there's a great deal of suffering, and there's a great deal of issues that journalists spend a great deal of time trying to highlight. But without these considerations of aesthetics, it's not going to draw people into those subjects. And we need to, I think, really see the world as it is rather than the way that we would like it to be. Because if you start from the point of view, which I always did, that journalism and photography is about truth and about seeking out the truth, no matter how unpalatable or uncomfortable those truths may be, at least you have a foundation. And if it is your wish to somehow better the world, to make a difference, to make change, positive change, you need to start from a solid foundation of understanding the world we in fact inhabit rather than the world we would like to see. So I think it really reflects, the World Press Photo tends to reflect a very narrow view of the world and the way it is. It's very, I think, for want of a better word, I think it's quite middle class in its outlook. I don't think it's concerned very much with things that are difficult. I mean, there was a series of photographs about Ukraine, and one of the things that I found difficult is the portrayal of the Ukraine war as being a simple good and evil dynamic, and I think it's far more nuanced and much more complex than that. Mm-hmm. And I think by avoiding these kinds of issues and really challenging our perception of them, I think it is a problem, and it's sort of counterproductive, as I said.
Right. The introduction of the iPhone has, we've had citizen journalism, citizen doctors, obviously citizen photographers as well, but it's really dumbed down the medium, and a lot of photographs are kind of acceptable. I think we were talking the other day, and I mentioned how I have one client who refuses to put bylines on photographs because they find those photographs ordinary and just taken from an iPhone, not worthy of a byline, but yet they're publishing them because they're cheap.
I mean, that's a problem as well. I mean, it's a slightly separate one, but yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think that proliferation of photography has rather, things that there is no vetting process. I mean, one of the things that I think is great about the digital age is that it's got rid of a kind of a gatekeeping mentality. Mm-hmm. People can produce their own content and upload it, and it can be seen by, thousands, potentially millions. That in itself is a good thing. But what happens with that, also the kind of drawback with that, is the fact that, there are no standards, that anyone can publish anything at any time.
Right.
So, rather, I think it's confused our understanding of what is good and what is bad, and question what is good and what is bad. I think the World Press Photo actually reflects that. I mean, I think there's really poor judgments. I mean, really, really shocking. I can't believe the kind of work that they're promoting at the moment.
Okay.
But again, I think there's an agenda here which is more ideological and less to do with, truth-seeking. And I think that's what journalism really at its heart should be, and photojournalism should be no different. But also understanding that photography is its own separate language, that it actually conveys different kind of things. One of the great things, particularly in photojournalism, is that it enables us to empathize with people who are on the other side of the world, who we have no other connection, to see people as people. And I think that's one of the things that's kind of lost. But I think also those photographs to draw you in, again, to go back to my central point, is that aesthetics are key to drawing people in, because it activates a part of the brain which wants to know more. And by wanting to know more, of course, you can lead people into a text story. This is why photographs and words,
they go together well.
One another perfectly. They lead you into the world so you can understand the context of the photography.
Yep.
And a lot of that's been lost.
Shouldn't the onus be on world press photo to be the standard bearer. In terms of what I was saying before about how we're awash with ordinary iPhone pics and the lack of aesthetics, the world press photo, should they not be the standard bearer? Should they not be the arbiter in terms of what's great and what's unacceptable? And what you're saying about all coming across as dreadfully middle class, it seems to be dreadfully counterproductive.
I've always been interested in the stories that have been overlooked, ignored, or misrepresented. And that's what I think about photojournalism itself, should be interested in doing those kinds of things. Yeah, I think the world press photo reflects the sort of a wider malaise with the way of the world, and that it's opened up a floodgate. Mm-hmm. The judging criteria, that's what I'm calling into question. I don't know what constitutes, and I don't think the world press photo knows what constitutes a press photograph in this day.
Right, that's where I wanted to go next, actually, what does constitute the press? Yep.
Well, it's objective, all photography. Mm-hmm. And I think that, to be fair to the world press photo that they've got in today's world, and I think there is a desire and a feeling that they ought to be producing stuff or highlighting and celebrating photography that is, I think that it's moving on beyond certain ideas, that there's some idea of progression. And I think, unfortunately, photography often it's self-referential, meaning that you're building again and again. How many different ways can you photograph people who are suffering from dementia? It's quite limited, obviously. Or how many different ways can you photograph people suffering the effects of the climate crisis? Again, it's quite difficult to do. But I think the submission of photographs, because they're of a worthy subject, but not necessarily aesthetically strong, is a mistake. And I think what it tends to do to the group is that strong photographs within the group that are selected for the world press photo or on the social media feed, rather than elevate the weaker images, what it does is it pulls down the stronger ones.
Right.
So what do you have? You'll have people turning off. Think, well, this no longer holds a standard. And I think that's a shame.
You mentioned before the shifting meaning of what constitutes the press. How has that impacted on the awards and photography?
Well, I think it's huge because obviously often call the mainstream media or the traditional media or the legacy media, they are dwindling and getting smaller. Meanwhile, independent journalism is on the rise. And I think there are lots of exciting things, but there's some dangers. I think one of the things is that in order to have standards, you need to have people who are going to set those standards and judge the work that's submitted to those standards. But at the same time, without those, for want of a better word, gatekeepers, you've got a proliferation of stuff that may not otherwise get seen. So I think it is a very confusing time. But I think that the world press photo, in order to sort its identity crisis, if it even understands it has an identity crisis, is to set very clear parameters about what do you mean by the press? And then we can work it out. But at the moment, what I just see is it's a real sort of confusing mix of images, which tick almost every box of every kind of genre that exists outside of photojournalism as well as photojournalism itself. So very hard to judge it because it hasn't really stated what it represents and who it represents and what the principles and guiding principles are.
I think this is a similar narrative with the written word, in that there are no filters. The gatekeepers, if there are any, are limited. The internet and even traditional media, for want of a better term, is awash with stories. People are focusing more and more on local stories, and so are their editors. And I find it odd and disappointing that, say, a story like the civil conflict, the war in Burma, Myanmar, is pretty much ignored. But every other story is being covered to the nth degree. The minor story, the traditional pothole story in a local newspaper. And there is no filter process, and perhaps we need that to return in order to put some kind of semblance back into the media about what is important and what is not, what is a great photo and what is really a vanity project.
Yeah, it's very difficult, isn't it? Because it's on the one hand, you don't want people to sort of somehow, you don't want sort of censorship by omission.
Exactly.
But at the same time, you need to maintain a degree of some standards. In my writing, I also write. I love a really hard editor. It's like somebody to go through my work, somebody who I trust and respect, go through my work ruthlessly. The same with the photography. I need to show other people to say, okay, does this work? And if not, why not?
Right.
should I take it out? Should I keep it in? Those sort of questions. I think it's vital. To work in a silo on your own is ridiculous. How do you know that your work is any good if it's not reaching people? So I think that's very important. But it's a difficult one because it's a very fine line between... I mean, how many times, Luke, have you pitched stories and I pitched stories to publications and they simply said no because you know more about the subject than the editor, or maybe it just doesn't fit in with a particular slant.
Yeah, the agenda.
Reasons, whether the story itself is good, but whether it fits an agenda or an idea that the publication is promoting. So I don't know. It's a difficult one.
It is a difficult one, and with photography, though, it's much more of a imprecise science. I mean, I have all the photo books going back for decades. You look at Harold Robbins, Don McCullum, Philip Jones Griffiths, who you mentioned in the piece you wrote for Substack. And I've worked with a lot of photographers over the years. I've taken a lot of photographs as well. And the only reason I'm saying that is because I've sat down with photo editors, and they might have 20 photographs, of which 5 are going to go, and they'll be looking at 2 screens, 1 photo on each. It's like this one or this one, this one or this one, this one or this one. Throw it out, take this one. And it's such an imprecise science. It's a little bit like, why is this a great photo? I can't find the words to say why this is the best photograph. It just is. Look at it, if you understand.
Well, I mean, I think that's kind of runs to the heart of it, isn't it? I mean, it is incredibly subjective. And again, well-pressed photo, I don't envy their job, and it's a tough one for sure. But it's entirely subjective. But you need to understand photography. It's taken me a while to actually work on a very different plane to the written word. So, for example, if you're captioning a photograph, you don't write what's in the photograph. You don't try and describe what's there. Man sits on couch eating chips. Right. You tell people the information they can't see, the contextual information. What photography does do is it enables people to connect. I mean, it's taken me quite a long time to understand how photography works, but it works in such a way that it's not something that you can necessarily describe. It is its own language.
Right.
What photography does, as you know, it enables people to connect with a story instantaneously, within milliseconds. Suddenly they can see something and they can get a sense of what the story is about. They can connect with the people in the photograph in a way that the written word just simply doesn't operate. It's an entirely different kind of medium, obviously. But I think understanding that is something which I've noticed certainly in this World Press Photo competition is likely that the aesthetic considerations are very much secondary to the story that they're trying to tell. But unfortunately, the problem with that is that if the photographs aren't strong, i.e. they don't lead you in, they don't stimulate you, then you're running risk of turning people off, so they're not even going to bother to look at it. I mean, the National Geographic magazine, for those people who still collect it, nobody buys it for the writing, as everyone knows. Everyone buys it because of the amazing photography in it.
And that's that's what we had as kids.
And it leads you, and photographs will lead you with. Sorry.
No, I was just saying that National Geographic, that's what we had as kids, and that would help frame your brain about what is a good photograph and what's not a good photograph. And if everybody is simply looking at their iPhones and these crap pics that get thrown up all the time, it doesn't really take it much further. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, if you look at the winning photograph for the World Press Photo this year, I think it is a deserved winner. It's a very strong image. It's aesthetically strong, which leads you into the story, which is about Gaza. I can understand it all makes perfect sense to me. However, the frame they chose for the winning shot, you don't see a face. It's a faceless image, so it's mute in that regard. There is another frame, however, which shows the woman who's cradling this body of her niece, and she momentarily looks up, and you can see the anguish on her face. And it hits you in the chest. I mean, it's a tough photograph to look at, but that's precisely why it's a great photograph, because immediately you get a sense, you get that feeling, it carries that emotional impact. And that's what's lacking in some of the work, is that it's just, you can't really connect with it. It's like, it's a kind of boring photograph. It doesn't lead you anywhere. So it is a problem.
You covered Cambodia, Burma, Southeast Asia extensively over the years. You're well aware of stories that were deserved of a higher profile in the international media, and it never quite gets there. Right now I'm thinking of Myanmar. I've just been up over the border. I know you've done a lot of work there over the years, and it's one of those conflicts that's constantly difficult to get across about how sad, nasty and tragic it is to the wider world. And we used to rely on photography to get that message across. We need great photos to move people and get them to notice what's happening here in Southeast Asia and Myanmar. It's right in your back door. And nowadays, it's just becoming increasingly harder to do that because I think great photos have to compete with crap photos to get the reader's attention.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's difficult. Again, I kind of can't help thinking that when it starts to get complicated, people rather switch off. I mean, to my mind, complexity is, trying to understand and take apart the complexity in order to reach some sort of comprehension is part of, for me, the attraction of doing it. Mm-hmm. I think there's an awful lot of stuff that I think, as I said before, that tends to be somewhat ideological. And my problem with that is, for me, journalism, photography included, is about gathering evidence. It's about going out into the world, checking it out, trying to understand it, and then repackage it so that others who maybe don't have the opportunity to go out and see for themselves can get a sense of what is going on. And I think that's becoming less and less the way people operate. I mean, again, to go back to the unvarnished truth, that's what I want to know about, even if it really disturbs me and it makes me very uncomfortable indeed. But when I hear about, in universities and academia, young kids who are just at the age when I started out in the world, talking about being worried about being offended or finding stuff difficult and rather turning their backs on it and not wishing to engage, there's something more at play here. And I think that's a shame because, as I said, photography and journalism should be about gathering information and collecting evidence to try and explain to somebody on the other side of the world what's going on. That seems to be happening less and less in general.
I think you're quite right about...
But
Sorry, mate.
No, go for it.
I think you're quite right about the students coming out of university, and I know quite a few, and they're very good. And I've met quite a few in the field. Too many of them, though, firmly believe they need to bring themselves into the job. And with that comes their prejudices. And a lot of them are really looking for affirmation of the story they already have in their mind. And they don't seem to want to understand what the realities are on the ground because it doesn't fit. And therefore, they're going for a photograph that fits what they've already decided the story will be. And that's their kind of, particularly, the kids coming out of universities. And these days they all have master's degrees as well. And it's like their minds are already made up.
Yeah, I find that strange because, I always thought that photography particularly, but also journalism more generally, is a great way to check out the world, to go and find out, well, what is really going on, to find out for yourself. And the idea, and one of the things is, you all have a preconceived ideas of what a particular story might or might not be.
Yep.
And I think one of the great situations with a set of ideas, and you have them completely changed. And that's really exciting because you're learning something new. It can be grim, but it can also be uplifting, and it doesn't really matter. But I think that's the point. The problem now, which you've highlighted, is that people tend to be much more ideological in their act. I'm always suspicious of ideologues. I spent too much time studying ideological, regimes that have been absolutely disastrous.
Sure, the Khmer Rouge was one.
Well, no, from your experience too.
Yeah.
Khmer Rouge, obviously, in Burma is another. And I think the problem with ideologues is their position is fixed. I want it according to the evidence. There's one golden rule about journalism: it should be evidence-based. The trouble is nowadays you can sit anywhere and you can pontificate without any experience at all of any kind of report or spending any time anywhere. But your opinions, if you're loud enough, your opinions can you can talk about anything you want to talk about, even though you may have spent absolutely no time on the ground. I grew up on the journalists of the 60s and 70s, and I suppose the 80s. People like John Pilger, I know Philip Jones Griffiths, all of these kind of mavericks, really. People who didn't take no for an answer, who were naturally suspicious of those in authority, and went out and bothered to go and find out for themselves. And that, to me, was absolutely key and very inspiring. And I couldn't wait to get out the door and get going.
I agree.
But it seems to be a different world now.
Yeah, I agree totally. And I've always got a thrill, like you, when you are in the field and you have these expectations for a story, which we all have, and then you find out they're totally wrong. And I was watching Whiskey Tango Foxtrot last night for the first time, 20 years later. But there was actually a scene in that movie which was quite true. The Taliban were accused in Afghanistan of blowing up the wells to draw water from that the American soldiers were building. And in fact, it wasn't the Taliban, it was the women in the village because they preferred to go down to the river and meet with other women so they can chat and gossip than actually have a well in their backyard. And on many occasions in Afghanistan and Cambodia and in Burma, you don't want to be in a position where you have to defend the dreadful regime for what they've done. But, the stories aren't always correct. The prejudices that people bring just legitimise a lot of these stories because that's the easy story to tell. The military is saying this, therefore we report that. But when you get out there, you might find it's something completely different.
No, I was just thinking, if I stripped everything away as to what drives me to do the things that I have done or do, is really about learning. It's about learning firsthand. It's about checking things out and really getting a full, rounded sense of something. So it's all about learning. And if you're not learning, I feel, what's the point? To my mind, that's the main kind of driving force for doing any kind of journalism is to learn something new, or something you didn't know about, or to have a preconceived idea ripped out and changed.
Yeah. Do you think it
and
would...
with the World Press Festival, I just see what I see is, and I see this very often with other journalism as well, is simply we're telling our stories back to us. We're reflecting our own values rather than actually engaging with values that are different to us, to our own. I mean, for instance, you get called a heretic now if you want to understand Putin's point of view, as Tucker Carlson got into trouble when he went to interview him in Moscow. I mean, why wouldn't you want to understand an adversary's point of view? That's what I never understand. I mean, this is the idea that somehow you shouldn't talk to people you disagree with. I mean, where did that come from?
And if you're coming from one side of the fence and you say the Americans, and you want to defeat the adversary, well, you better understand what he's like, where he's coming from, and what he's got behind him.
Yeah. No, exactly. It doesn't mean you have to agree with him. It doesn't mean you are siding with him. I mean, if I took that point of view, I would never have gone to find Pol Pot's chief executioner, and he wouldn't have ended up in prison.
Indeed, and that was a great
example.
And I'm going to interrupt you there, Nick. I was going to mention that The Lost Executioner was one of Nick's books, and you carried a photograph, if I remember correctly, back in the days when we didn't have digital phones, of Duch or Kang Kwek Yew.
The end of the war in Cambodia.
Right.
And as you know, the Khmer Rouge were a very secretive organization, so it was very difficult to penetrate, to get into areas of their control. And if you did, it was extremely dangerous. But when they started to collapse, I thought, well, this is a good time to maybe try and find some of the less savory characters of that regime. I didn't think the guy would be alive, and I thought that it would just make a really good story to traverse former Khmer Rouge areas that have just opened up and to talk to people about what life was like. And I remember I proposed it to several journalist friends. This is before I wrote myself, so I often teamed up with journalists, and all of them turned me down. And then it was one of those kind of weird experiences where I was on an assignment in the west of the country. I had a day free, and we were right in the west of Cambodia, the former Khmer Rouge area that had just opened up. And in the end, he walked up to me. It was bizarre.
An extraordinary story. I mean, you found Duch, Kang Kwek Yew, and went back, interviewed him for the Far East Economic Review with another journalist, Nate Thayer, and he was out in the open, and he was one of the first to be prosecuted before the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, and he was eventually jailed. I remember meeting you at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, and the first verdict wasn't really what people wanted to hear because it was a due sentence, but in the end he was jailed pretty much for life and he died behind bars. But that probably wouldn't have been possible without you carrying that photograph around of him. And I'll just quickly add that the Duch trial became evidence as read, in that it was the evidence collected by the prosecutors of the crimes committed by Duch at S21 that was used to obtain the convictions for crimes against humanity and genocide, which were eventually registered against other Khmer Rouge leaders, in particular Nuon Chea and Khieu Sampan. So, I mean, it's quite a legacy you have there.
Yeah, I mean, it was largely an accident. I mean, I think people have overblown it, really. I mean, it was largely an accidental encounter, although I, thought about it for many years.
Right.
The idea they're actually finding him I never really thought it would happen, but I thought, well, why do we try anyway?
Yeah.
So it was kind of, and it is also about serendipity. It was a sort of a perfect, it was timing as well. I mean, the fact is, when people commit these kind of crimes, the magnitude of these kind of crimes, for the vast majority, they get away with it. This is one of the very unusual circumstances where a journalist goes to find former executioner, interviews him, he confesses, he's arrested, he's then incarcerated, tried, convicted. I mean, I think that's fairly unusual.
It's also a very good job.
Well, thank you. But, the strange thing is that it was all the result of a photograph as well, which I used to carry around, as you say, Luke. So it was a photograph taken by the Khmer Rouge, off the Khmer Rouge, and that was how I identified.
Do you think some of these days will return? I'm a little more optimistic about the future, certainly more optimistic than many of our peers, but these days I'm more under the impression that, yes, we are kind of bumbling along the bottom of the industry, but I do think things are improving. I think the quality's improving. I think readers and journalists and photographers are redefining what we do and how we do it, but it might take another 10, 20 years to sort this out, and that could well take us back to the World Press Photo, in that if they want to be the standard bearer for what is a great press photograph or a mixed media photograph that delivers the message, then they have to step up to the plate.
I think so. I think they need to really define what they mean by the world press photo. Who are they? What do they represent? Mm-hmm. But looking at the photographs that have been submitted and the ones that have across their social media presence, it's really disappointing, to say the least. But I think they do, and I think there still is a meaningful role. I mean, this is kind of, whilst people can get quite pessimistic about journalism, when you've had the persecution of people like Assange and other whistleblowers, there's also a great deal of excitement, I think, because of this situation where things are moving so rapidly and changing so rapidly. One of the things I think is very exciting is dissent. I mean, I've always been of the view of being outside an established world and looking in. There is an incredible amount of good online journalism which is taking apart official narratives, which is what journalism should have been doing. And I think people are really getting a sense to what extent that the established media or the mainstream media have held on to particular narratives which suited, those in power. And I think that's very exciting. But I don't see this so much with the World Press Photo. Perhaps it's also the problem of being something that's very well established and has a great reputation. Take away that reputation and looking at the work now, I don't see that being upheld at all. You're right, Luke. I think they really do need to really make an effort to ask themselves some honest questions about not only the work that they do, but what they're there to do. What is the point of the World Press Photo?
Nick Dunlop, it's been great talking with you.
Yeah, you too, Luke.
And I'll just add one other quick thing. That I have spoken to other journalists and I've interviewed them for this program, and quite a few are rather pessimistic, which I find disappointing, because at the end of the day, media will always be there. It is constantly going to roll on, and it is so inextricably linked to democratic values, which I know sounds a little bit corny and perhaps a bit trite, but as you get older, you sort of realise and appreciate these aspects of culture, government, democracy a damn sight more. And it will roll on, and I do feel that it can only get better, but again, it comes back to defining what it is. And perhaps that's where not just the World Press Photo, but a lot of institutions related to journalism have let the game down, and perhaps that can only improve.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some great voices out there. I'm all for dissenting voices, which you get less and less of within the kind of traditional mainstream media. And,
right.
There are some great Matt Taibbi, Chris Hedges. There's a whole raft of them. These are dissenting voices who do what job a journalist should be doing. They're challenging in ways that I think the mainstream media are being shown up. So I think it is a very exciting time. And perhaps this old model, it deserves to die. Perhaps, I don't know. Perhaps the World Press Photo need to step up as well in order to ensure its own survival, to become a bit more relevant and be a bit more of a standard bearer, rather than champion ideological or notions of ideology or a particular ideological agenda. Yeah. I think that would be important. And to get back to what journalism really is about, which is going out into the world, gathering the evidence and telling stories.
Just quickly, what are your plans for the next few years? COVID has come and gone, and most of us are still rebuilding, but you're based in Bangkok. Burma is nearby, Cambodia is on the other side, Laos to your north. What are you looking at over the next few years?
Several things, but I've been working on a really long-term project about a 17th century battlefield battle that's been written out of Irish history, which is where I started taking photographs as a boy. So So I've got an exhibition coming up in Ireland. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, various different things. Because I do writing, I do editing, I do lots of different kinds of things. I've got various different fingers in different pies. It's just a question of making it all make sense and financially viable. But yeah, I've got things to get on with, for sure.
Nick Dunlop, thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thanks, Luke.